Hi, everybody. It's Jay, and I am back in the booth with you for another sneak peek video preview for this week's new audiobook release here on Say with Jay. Our new release this week is The Cowboy's Best Friend's Sister. It's the fourth book in Jessie Gussman's original Sweetwater Ranch Western Cowboy Romance series. And I've got more about the book and a sample for you in just a moment. But I wanted to share a story that I heard last week. Now, normally, when I'm thinking of some little anecdote to share or whatever, I usually start with the book or the sample that we're going to be doing and kind of work it backwards to find something that kind of ties in if I can. But, you know, being completely honest here, I read this story and just knew I wanted to share it with you guys. I guess you can probably draw some parallels to our story, but that wasn't how it started. Anyway, and also, in the sense of full disclosure, um, I actually read about the book I'm going to tell you about in another book that I've mentioned here before, Tony Dungy's An Uncommon Life. But I want to talk about a book, The Soul of Baseball. It's a book by Joe Podansky. And The Soul of Baseball is about a series of road trips that Joe took with Buck O'Neill. Buck O'Neill, for those of you who don't know, was a venerable Negro League player and who went on to be the first African American coach in the major leagues. Now, when they took these road trips, Buck was 93 years old. And Joe was constantly amazed at Buck's youthful vigor and, more importantly, at his constant positive outlook on everything. And, I guess in a way it's kind of surprising because if you were to make a list of people who were probably justified in being a little bit bitter with their circumstances, Buck O'Neill could be on that list. He was an enormously talented baseball player and, without question, would have been a superstar in the major leagues during that period. But he was relegated to playing in the Negro Leagues because of, as he loved to call it, his beautiful tan. And, that kind of slight, both on the field and off throughout his entire life, would certainly make many of us bitter, understandably so, but not Buck. He always chose to be positive and joyful. A good example of that was relayed when the book opens. They, Joe and Buck, make a road trip to Houston, Texas, to see the Astros play. Between innings, after warm-ups, the Houston right fielder comes over to the crowd and tosses the ball he was warming up with into the crowd for a young boy. But at the last second, a grown man jumps in front and grabs the ball. Now, of course, the crowd is angry. They boo the guy. And Joe is just livid, just seething at the guy that he would do such a thing. But Buck just looks up at him and smiles and says, "Don't be so hard on the guy. You don't know, he might have a kid at home." And that calmed Joe down for a bit, but as he says, he wanted to be angry at the guy. And he thought about it for a minute, then he turns to Buck and says, "Well, why didn't he bring his kid to the game?" Buck just immediately turns to him and smiles and says, "Maybe his kid's home sick." It was at that moment that Joe realized he would never get Buck to say a negative word. This is somebody who his entire life has refused to be a victim, who has refused to see life as anything other than an occasion for joy every single day. You only go around this world once, this life one time. You can spend your life looking for the negative, or you can be like Buck and consider every single day as the miraculous and joyous occasion it is, and a chance to find that joy and to give grace. That's a pretty cool thing. And if more of us were like Buck O'Neill, the world would most certainly be a better place. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the cowboy's best friend's sister. The cowboy's best friend's sister is the story of Sawyer Olsen. We met his siblings, his younger siblings, Palmer and Louise, in the first and second book of this series. And it's also about Georgia Hanson. We met Georgia's older brother, Ford, in her brothers, I should say, Ty and Ford, in the second and third books of this series. But as you may recall from the epilogue to book number 3, The Cowboy's Beauty, Georgia has been on a vacation, an extended vacation of Europe. And while she is gone, Sawyer develops a case of pneumonia. He does that is because Sawyer seems to have a singularly strong sense of that North Dakota independence in him. And he is determined, above all, to make his ranch work and to carve out his own, corner of life. But his ranch is not doing well. He bought it at a fairly low price because it also had no house on the land. It did have more or less a glorified storage shed that he's been using as a ramshackle shack, essentially, and doing some rather desperate things to try to make ends meet, including like eating every other day. And because of that, he was not taking very good care of himself, and that probably is what spurred his case of pneumonia. But if you recall in the epilogue to The Cowboy's Beauty, Ford finds his best friend, Sawyer, on the ground and practically unconscious. They get him to the hospital in time, thankfully, and he is recovering from his pneumonia there when the book opens. He is still not well at all, but because of that independent streak, he knows he's got to get home to take care of his livestock and to get his farm secure. Well, he has come across a rather desperate opportunity to save his farm. And like in the previous books, he's received an inheritance, or he will receive an inheritance with a very large sum of money, but he has to get married. So he posts an ad on Facebook and finds a woman who agrees, for a price, to marry him and stay with him for a year to satisfy the conditions of the inheritance. In the meantime, he decides to make a break to escape from the hospital where he's been secured because he's already tried to pull out his IVs and respirator tube. And so he decides to make a break for it and somehow get back to his ranch himself. And it fails spectacularly, I'll just say that. But about this time, Georgia has come home and has gone to the hospital to check on him. Well, she agrees to take him under her care, to be his guardian, his custodian, and because of that, the doctor agrees to let him be released to go home. Well, the three people, Sawyer, his bride-to-be, and Georgia, find themselves stuck in his shack, and, well, how will it turn out? You'll have to come back this Friday to find out. But here is a sample of The Cowboy's Best Friend's Sister. I hope you enjoy it, and then you will come back this Friday for the full audiobook here on Say with Jay.
Hop on. Her eyes narrowed, and he thought she was going to argue. He hoped she didn't, because he really didn't want her going out in the field by herself, especially since he didn't know what the weather was going to be or how far away the cow might have gone. She didn't argue, but took hold of his shoulder and swung a leg over. She sat down close to him. Not that she had a choice, since the machine was small. It took his weakened lungs a few seconds to remember to breathe. His heart wobbled. Then she wrapped her arms around his waist. He closed his eyes, trying to regain his equilibrium. He'd spent the last week or so fighting the black spots that swam before his eyes, fighting to breathe, fighting to keep his world from tilting. It was happening all over again, but not because of him being sick. All the same feelings, but different. How was he to know his body would go haywire when Georgia touched him? "Is something wrong?" Georgia yelled over the wind and the rumble of the machine. "It needs to warm up a bit." Not entirely true, but close enough. He could ride both ways, but if the machine quit on them, he didn't think he could walk the whole way home. He'd die trying. He twisted the handle throttle and the machine jumped. Georgia squealed and her hold on him tightened. He liked it. The machine was old, but it had plenty of juice under the hood. He buzzed over to the gate. Georgia didn't wait for him, but hopped off and opened it, waiting for him to drive through before she closed it behind him and hopped back on. Ready for the reactions this time, he enjoyed how it felt to be close to a woman. No, not just any woman. It wouldn't be the same if Danielle were on behind him. He was enjoying how it felt to have Georgia holding on to him as they flew out over the snow. Almost like really flying, and so much fun that he barely noticed the biting wind on his face. Georgia huddled behind him, letting his body block most of it for her. He had to watch when the front end dipped, since the old machine had lost its windshield long ago, and the dips threw snow up in his face. But it wasn't like there was anything he could hit. He just needed to make sure he didn't lose the cow's trail, and it was so obvious that it wouldn't even be hard to follow in the dark. They followed the trail the whole way to the other end of the pasture, and he was definitely glad he'd gone with Georgia. Although he was shivering so badly, she had to feel it even through his coat, since her arms were tight around his waist. But as they pulled closer, his heart drooped. The calf wasn't up. It wasn't moving either. "At least the mom's up. She'll make it," Georgia spoke at his back. Yeah. He couldn't pretend to not be disappointed. This was the first calf he'd lost. He wasn't so naive that he thought he'd never lose a head. It wasn't even the money, really. It was the pride he took in his job, the fact that the little life on the ground represented 10 months of work for the mama beside it, but mostly the fact that a good man took care of his animals. "Hey, it moved," Georgia said as he motored slowly toward the cow. He didn't want to scare her. Really? He hadn't seen anything. "Yes, I'm sure of it." She moved, and he thought she was so excited she was going to jump off before he stopped. "Hang on." He got as close as he felt he could without having the cow get upset. "Watch her. She might be protective." Black Angus were known as easy calfers, but they could be protective of their offspring, like any good beef cow. He didn't have that much experience with dairy, but like chickens who were bred to lay every day didn't usually sit on their eggs, dairy cattle, who often spent less than an hour with their babies, had that protective instinct bred out of them. He'd been headbutted a few times. One notable time, he'd broken a rib when an angry mother smashed him into the fence. "I've done this a couple of times myself," Georgia said, not with anger, but maybe a touch of sarcasm. "Sorry, buckaroo scoop." He'd reverted to his default defense mechanism. When Georgia started to get under his skin, when he started to think and feel things he shouldn't about her, he came up with a scoop name to remind her, but especially himself, that she was off limits. He didn't look around, but he could almost guarantee that her lips had flattened and her eyes narrowed. Maybe she mumbled, "Stupid scoop." Maybe she didn't. It didn't matter. His heart said it for her.
Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.